Silence is not the absence of force. It is its compression. The quiet mind is often mistaken for a passive one, yet passivity is a surface judgment made by observers who rely on noise to map intention. What appears compliant is frequently unregistered resistance, operating beneath thresholds that authority depends on to locate leverage. Control requires visibility. Silence withholds it. There is a paradox embedded here. The less a system reacts outwardly, the more difficult it becomes to adjust, influence, or correct from the outside. Quiet does not signal surrender. It signals opacity, and opacity disrupts prediction. Power seeks patterns. It looks for rhythm, response, escalation. Loudness provides these cues effortlessly. It advertises position. Quiet does not. It removes reference points. Without feedback, external pressure loses calibration. The effort to dominate becomes inefficient, uncertain, and prone to error. This is why quiet individuals are often misread as simple. Complexity that does not announce itself invites underestimation. That misreading is not accidental. It emerges from a structural bias. Systems assume that importance expresses itself. When it does not, importance is discounted. Yet the quiet position holds an internal coherence that does not require external reinforcement. It is self-contained. It does not lean outward to be validated or corrected. This makes it resistant not through opposition, but through absence of entry. Control operates through hooks, emotional hooks, narrative hooks, predictive hooks. Quietness removes the visible attachment points. There is nothing to pull, nothing to provoke reliably, nothing to mirror back. Influence loses traction. This does not mean the quiet state is peaceful. Internally, it may be highly active, but that activity is not broadcast. It remains unconverted into signals that others can intercept. This internal containment is often mistaken for emptiness. It is not. The paradox sharpens. Here, quietness increases internal density, while decreasing external accessibility. The more contained the internal process, the less available it becomes for manipulation. Control depends on shared surfaces. Quietness reduces surface area. There is also a temporal dimension. Loud reactions collapse time. They respond immediately, allowing others to move alongside them. Quiet reactions delay. They stretch time. Delay introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty weakens control structures that depend on immediate compliance or resistance. Silence also disrupts narrative dominance. Control often works by telling a story and inviting participation in it. Loud participants accept the story by responding within its frame. Quiet participants do not confirm the frame. The story continues without them, unstable. This absence is unsettling. It produces a pressure to interpret. Assumptions rush in to fill the gap. Those assumptions are rarely accurate, but they guide action anyway. Control becomes guesswork. Quietness resists categorization. It does not clarify allegiance or opposition. It does not reveal intention early. This ambiguity is not strategic in a conscious sense. It is structural. It emerges from a reduced need to externalize internal states. The result is a form of psychological independence that cannot be easily negotiated with. There is no clear reward or threat that reliably shifts behavior, because the internal reference system does not depend heavily on external approval or correction. This does not make the quiet position superior. It makes it difficult. Difficulty is not dominance. It is friction, and friction disrupts smooth control. Observers often attempt to fill the silence by escalating pressure. They increase volume, intensity, insistence. This rarely works. Escalation assumes that resistance is proportional and reactive. Quietness is neither. It absorbs without reflecting. The more pressure applied, the less information returned. Control mechanisms begin to operate blind. They act without feedback, increasing the likelihood of miscalculation. There is a final contradiction. Quietness is often cultivated as a response to external instability, yet once established, it becomes a source of instability for those attempting to manage it. What was meant to reduce disturbance introduces it elsewhere. This is why quiet individuals are hard to control, not because they oppose control, but because they do not participate in its language. The tension remains unresolved. Silence continues to be read as weakness, even as it quietly undermines the structures that depend on being heard. Quietness functions through internal mechanics, that are rarely observed because observation depends on outward movement. The absence of visible response forces perception inward. What is usually expressed externally becomes managed internally, redistributed across attention, memory, and restraint. Perception narrows, not in capacity, but in allocation. External stimuli are registered without immediate translation into reaction. This delay is not hesitation, it is filtration. Sensory input is processed through layers before it is permitted to alter behavior. Many signals never pass through. This internal filtering changes narration. Most individuals narrate themselves continuously, adjusting behavior in response to how that narration is received. Quiet individuals reduce this loop. The internal story is not constantly rewritten to align with external feedback. It becomes less performative, more structural. Without constant narration for others, self-narration becomes denser. Thoughts are not shaped for clarity or persuasion. They are shaped for coherence. This creates a private logic that does not require agreement to remain stable. Emotional self-regulation follows a similar pattern. Emotion is not suppressed, but contained. Containment differs from denial. The emotion is allowed to exist internally without being converted into outward signal. This conversion is optional, not automatic. Because of this, emotional escalation loses its usual leverage. External pressure often seeks emotional leakage as confirmation of impact. Quiet regulation denies that confirmation. The emotion remains present but unreadable. This unreadability alters how influence is experienced. Influence relies on shared emotional timing. When timing is internalized, synchronization fails. Attempts to steer emotion arrive late or misaligned. The internal system becomes self-referential. Regulation is guided by internal thresholds rather than external cues. Approval and disapproval lose immediacy. They are processed as data, not directives. This creates an unusual form of autonomy. Not independence from others, but independence from immediate modulation. Behavior is less reactive. It moves according to internal pacing rather than external demand. Narration also becomes selective. Silence does not mean absence of thought. It means thought is not continuously exported. What is shared is often minimal, delayed, or incomplete. This incompleteness is not accidental. It reflects a reduced need to be fully understood. Misunderstanding becomes tolerable. When internal coherence is prioritized over external alignment, misunderstanding no longer threatens stability. This tolerance further weakens control mechanisms that depend on fear of misinterpretation. There is a cost. Internal containment increases cognitive load. Monitoring, filtering, regulating all require sustained effort. Quietness is not effortless calm. It is controlled compression. Over time, this compression reshapes identity. The self is experienced more as an internal process than a social object. External roles become secondary. Internal continuity becomes primary. This shift affects memory. Experiences are stored without immediate external validation. They are not anchored by reaction or acknowledgement. Memory becomes more private, less shared. This privacy reinforces internal reference systems. Attempts to penetrate this system often fail because they assume openness. Questions expect answers. Provocations expect reactions. Silence disrupts these expectations. The system does not break, but it does not open. Control strategies escalate, then fragment. Without feedback, adjustments become random. Pressure is applied without knowing where it lands. The internal system absorbs it without signaling damage or compliance. Eventually, interaction narrows. Engagement becomes minimal. The quiet position retracts further inward, not as withdrawal, but as consolidation. The internal structure tightens. At this point, quietness becomes a closed loop. Input is received, processed, and contained. Output is sparse. External influence circulates without entry. The system remains intact, but increasingly enclosed. The boundaries harden, not to exclude others, but to preserve internal regulation. Movement continues inside, but it is no longer accessible. The confinement is complete, not as isolation, but as inward occupation. Control begins to fail when impulse does not align with self-image. In quiet individuals, impulse rarely disappears. It accumulates. It presses against an internal boundary shaped by identity, rather than by immediate desire. Action is not denied, it is deferred, and deferral introduces instability. The internal conflict is subtle. On one side, there is impulse, raw, immediate, unfiltered. On the other, there is a constructed sense of self that values restraint, coherence, and internal order. These two do not resolve into harmony. They negotiate continuously. Suppression is often misnamed. What occurs is not erasure, but compression. Impulse is folded inward, held in place by an internal narrative that insists on consistency. The self-image demands control, not because impulse is dangerous, but because unpredictability threatens internal stability. This creates tension. The impulse does not weaken. It adapts. It becomes quieter, more persistent, less visible. It learns the contours of the internal system and presses where resistance is strongest. The quiet exterior conceals this pressure. From the outside, there is calm. Internally, there is movement constrained by narrow limits. Control is maintained but not secured. The self-image plays a critical role. It frames restraint as identity rather than as effort. The individual does not think, "I am restraining." The thought becomes, "This is who I am." This shift disguises labor as nature, but identity is not impermeable. Each suppressed impulse leaves residue, not guilt or shame, but awareness. Awareness of effort, awareness of instability beneath the surface. The conflict intensifies when impulse contradicts the internal narrative. The more distant the impulse is from the accepted self-image, the more force is required to contain it. Control becomes active rather than structural. At this stage, quietness begins to fracture. Internally, the system still appears controlled, but the internal cost increases. Energy is diverted toward maintenance. Attention narrows further. Flexibility decreases. Impulse seeks release through indirect channels. Thought patterns become repetitive. Focus drifts. Minor decisions carry disproportionate weight. These are not failures. They are pressure leaks. Control, once stable, becomes brittle. It holds, but it cannot bend. The internal system prioritizes preservation of identity over adaptation. This rigidity creates vulnerability. External influence senses this instability but misreads it. The quiet exterior suggests unshakable control. Pressure is applied at the wrong points. This misalignment allows the internal conflict to continue uninterrupted. Suppression now functions as conflict rather than management. The individual is no longer simply containing impulse. They are negotiating with it, monitoring it, guarding against it. Control requires vigilance. Vigilance consumes resources. Fatigue accumulates not physically but cognitively. The mind remains alert even in stillness. Rest does not fully disengage regulation. This constant internal monitoring erodes spontaneity. Action becomes calculated even when calculation is unnecessary. The system favors predictability over responsiveness. The self-image tightens. It becomes narrower, more defined, less tolerant of deviation. Identity hardens into a boundary rather than a framework. Impulse responds by fragmenting. It no longer presents as a unified urge. It appears as scattered impulses, incomplete thoughts, sudden shifts in attention. Control must track multiple points simultaneously. The internal conflict becomes decentralized. There is no single impulse to suppress. There are many small pressures, each insufficient alone but collectively destabilizing. At this point, control feels unstable, not collapsing but strained. The individual senses this strain but does not externalize it. The quiet exterior remains intact. Internally, coherence begins to crack. The self-image still governs, but its authority is questioned by the effort required to maintain it. The belief in effortless restraint erodes. This erosion does not produce rebellion. It produces fragmentation. Control persists, but without confidence. Decisions feel provisional. Identity feels conditional. The system continues to function, but it no longer feels whole. It operates in parts. Impulse contained here. Identity reinforced there. Attention stretched between them. The fracture does not resolve. It remains suspended, held together by habit rather than by integration. The quiet remains, but it no longer signifies stability. It signifies division. The pattern persists because it is supported by a belief that feels protective rather than restrictive. This belief does not announce itself. It operates quietly, embedded in the logic of self-preservation. It suggests that visibility invites interference, that expression invites distortion. That openness compromises internal order. The belief does not claim to be true, it claims to be safe. Quietness, in this structure, is not a preference. It is a safeguard. It reduces exposure. It limits intrusion. It maintains control by narrowing the channels through which others can exert influence. The belief equates containment with security. This belief forms early, not through instruction, but through accumulation. Each instance where silence prevented, escalation reinforces it. Each moment where restraint avoided misinterpretation strengthens it. Over time, the belief becomes less about specific outcomes and more about maintaining internal continuity. The belief is not rigid, it is adaptive. It learns. It updates its parameters based on perceived threat. It does not demand total silence. It demands selective expression, only what is necessary, only what is stable, only what can be controlled. Because the belief is protective, it resists. Challenge. Questioning it feels like removing a barrier without knowing what lies beyond. The belief does not frame itself as limiting. It frames itself as preserving what would otherwise be destabilized. This creates an internal loyalty. The individual does not feel constrained by the belief. They feel held by it. It provides a sense of boundary in environments that feel unpredictable. It offers a consistent internal rule when external rules fluctuate. The belief also organizes perception. Signals from others are filtered through it. Ambiguity is interpreted as risk. Excessive attention is interpreted as threat. The belief does not assume malice. It assumes volatility, and volatility requires containment. This belief sustains the quiet pattern even when external conditions change. Even when control is no longer necessary, the belief remains active. It does not scan for safety. It scans for deviation. Its function is not to assess reality, but to preserve structure. Importantly, the belief is not false. It has worked. It has prevented harm, confusion, and loss of internal coherence. Its effectiveness is part of why it endures. The system does not abandon what is proven useful, yet the belief has limits. It was formed under specific conditions, responding to specific pressures. As the internal system grows more complex, the belief must stretch to accommodate new demands. This stretching introduces tension. The belief begins to require maintenance. What was once automatic becomes deliberate. Silence must be chosen rather than defaulted. Restraint must be justified internally. The belief starts to consume attention. There is no immediate recognition of this cost. The belief still feels protective. It still feels necessary, but it begins to crowd other internal processes. Curiosity narrows. Expression feels heavier. Possibility feels less accessible. The belief does not forbid change. It delays it. It asks for certainty before movement. It asks for safety before exposure. These conditions are rarely fully met. As a result, motion slows. Quietness deepens, not as calm, but as caution. The internal system becomes conservative. It favors what is known over what is possible. This is not fear, it is preservation. Over time, the belief shifts subtly. It no longer asks, "Is this safe?" It asks, "Is this controllable?" Safety becomes secondary to manageability. What cannot be managed internally is deferred indefinitely. This shift introduces ambiguity. The belief was designed to protect internal stability, but now it begins to constrain internal expansion. The boundary it maintains becomes less clearly defined. It is no longer obvious what it protects against. The individual senses this uncertainty without naming it. There is a quiet doubt, not about the belief's intention, but about its scope. The belief still feels right, but its fit feels less precise. This imprecision creates friction. Decisions feel heavier. Silence feels less neutral. The internal system begins to question whether containment still serves the same function it once did. The belief does not collapse under this questioning. It adjusts. It tightens in some areas and loosens in others. The pattern continues, but with subtle distortions. Quietness remains. Control remains. But their meaning shifts. They are no longer purely protective. They are also preservative, holding onto a structure whose original purpose is becoming less clear. The belief sustains the aho pattern, but it does not explain it fully anymore. It protects, but it also obscures. It maintains order, but at the cost of clarity. The individual does not reject the belief. They remain aligned with it. Yet alignment no longer feels effortless. It feels negotiated. The pattern continues, supported by a belief that still offers safety, even as its boundaries blur. The uncertainty does not resolve. It remains suspended, quietly questioning the structure it sustains. The cost does not arrive. Suddenly, it accumulates quietly, distributed across time in increments too small to notice. Sustained containment reshapes the internal landscape. What was once an active choice becomes a background condition. Energy is continuously allocated toward monitoring, filtering, and maintaining internal boundaries. This allocation is subtle, but persistent. Over time, internal bandwidth narrows, not because capacity diminishes, but because availability does. Attention is occupied by regulation even in the absence of threat. The system remains partially engaged at all times. This constant engagement produces erosion rather than exhaustion. There is no collapse. There is a thinning. Reactions become slower, not from indecision, but from internal congestion. Each response must pass through multiple layers of restraint. The individual adapts to this friction. Expectations are adjusted downward. Fewer impulses are entertained. Fewer possibilities are explored. The internal world becomes quieter, not by intention, but by attrition. Emotional range compresses. Extremes are avoided because they require expression or adjustment. Neutral states become preferred because they demand less regulation. This preference is not conscious. It emerges from efficiency. Memory is affected. Experiences that might have expanded identity are stored without emphasis. They do not integrate fully. They remain isolated, unarticulated. Over time, memory becomes flatter, less textured. This flattening does not feel like loss. It feels like stability. The absence of disruption is interpreted as success. The system reinforces itself by equating quiet continuity with well-being. Yet something subtle is sacrificed. Internal spontaneity declines, not desire, but permission. Impulses are still generated, but fewer are granted passage. The threshold for action rises. As thresholds rise, internal distance increases. The individual observes their own impulses with detachment. This detachment initially feels like control. Later, it feels like separation. The separation is quiet. It does not announce itself as dissatisfaction. It registers as a mild disengagement from internal life. Thoughts become more procedural. Feelings become less immediate. Creativity, in its broadest sense, thins. Not artistic output specifically, but internal play. The capacity to explore without purpose diminishes. Exploration feels inefficient. The system favors predictability. Predictability reduces regulatory demand. Novelty increases it. Over time, novelty is avoided not out of fear, but out of fatigue. This fatigue is not recognized as such. There is no sharp contrast. The internal system simply becomes more conservative. It chooses known pathways. It repeats familiar patterns. Relationships are affected indirectly, not through withdrawal but through consistency. The individual becomes reliable, contained, stable, yet less internally available. Interaction occurs but without expansion. The self-image adapts again. Quietness is now associated not only with safety but with identity preservation. Change feels like erosion rather than growth. Stability becomes synonymous with selfhood. At this stage, the cost is not dramatic. There is no crisis. There is a gradual narrowing of internal space. The range of possible selves contracts. The individual may sense this contraction only in contrast, a moment of unexpected resonance, a fleeting sense of vitality that feels unfamiliar. These moments pass quickly, absorbed back into regulation. The loss is not mourned because it is not named. It is experienced as a faint absence, something that used to be present, now less so, without a clear memory of when it changed. Quietness continues to function. Control remains intact. External stability is maintained. The system works. But internally, the structure has shifted. What began as protection has become a mode of maintenance. Maintenance requires energy, and energy is finite. The erosion continues, not toward collapse, but toward a reduced internal horizon. Life becomes narrower without becoming unstable. There is no signal to stop, no alarm, only a subtle recognition, barely acknowledged, that something has been preserved at the cost of something else. The recognition does not disrupt the system. It settles quietly alongside it. The cost is paid slowly. Awareness does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as distance. The internal system does not suddenly understand itself. It begins to observe itself from a slight remove, not judgment, not correction, simply noticing the shape of its own containment. This distance changes nothing immediately. Quietness remains. Control remains. The belief structures remain intact. What changes is the relationship to them. They are no longer fully inhabited. They are seen. The individual becomes aware of how often restraint is applied without necessity, how often silence is chosen by default rather than by relevance. This awareness is not critical. It is neutral. It does not demand revision. Distance creates space, not for action, but for perception. Internal processes are no longer experienced only from within. They are also witnessed. The system gains a second layer of consciousness. This witnessing does not weaken control. It loosens identification with it. Control is no longer equivalent to selfhood. It becomes one function among others. The quiet pattern begins to feel optional, even when it remains active. Silence is still used, but it is no longer absolute. It is contextual. The internal system notes when it is useful and when it is merely habitual. This does not produce expression. It produces choice. Choice without urgency. Choice without promise of change. Awareness introduces a paradox of its own. The more clearly the system sees its constraints, the less compelled it feels to escape them. The need to resolve diminishes. Tension softens. This softening does not mean comfort. It means flexibility. The boundaries of the internal system become perceptible rather than rigid. They are felt as edges, not walls. Impulse is still present. Self-image is still present. Their conflict remains, but it is no longer entirely internalized as identity. It is recognized as a process. This recognition reduces the intensity of suppression, not because impulse is indulged, but because it is allowed to exist without immediate containment. The system tolerates a wider range of internal states. Tolerance expands. Internal space. Not dramatically, incrementally. A slight increase in room to move. The belief that sustained quietness protects internal order is not dismantled. It is contextualized. It is seen as one solution among others, rather than as a universal rule. This contextualization reduces its authority, without invalidating its purpose. The belief remains available, but not dominant. Awareness also reframes cost. The erosion described earlier becomes visible, not as damage, but as trade-off. What was preserved and what was reduced can now be held in the same frame. This holding does not demand recovery. It allows recognition. Recognition does not repair loss, but it prevents further unconscious narrowing. The system begins to notice moments when internal vitality appears. These moments are no longer dismissed as anomalies. They are noted, not pursued. Noticing without pursuit preserves distance. It avoids replacing one form of control with another. Awareness does not become optimization. This is where mastery is often misinterpreted. Awareness does not grant command, it grants perspective. Perspective does not act, it observes. The quiet individual does not become louder. They do not become more expressive. They become less identified with their silence. This subtle shift alters how control operates externally. Influence is still difficult, but for a different reason. Not because of opacity alone, but because the internal system is no longer rigidly defended. Control mechanisms encounter ambiguity rather than resistance. The system can engage or disengage without losing coherence. Predictability decreases further. Internally, the system rests differently. Regulation continues, but with less strain. Not because effort disappears, but because it is no longer justified by absolute necessity. The internal horizon widens slightly. Possibility does not rush in. It appears at the periphery, faint, but present. There is no conclusion here. Awareness does not culminate in resolution. It remains an ongoing condition. Distance is maintained, not crossed. The quiet remains. Control remains. But they are held lightly. At times, the system may wonder whether silence is being used or simply inherited. This wondering does not demand an answer. It only asks to be noticed. And in that noticing, something opens without needing to be entered.